Hello, Anne.
Hey, Margaret, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for getting up so early this morning to join.
I feel like always has me doing these early morning sessions, but this was really fun, and we had a great audience. This seems like it's a really great event.
It has been going really, really well, and the organizers are doing a good job of balancing in real life and virtual, which is a tricky one. So I think all of us attending virtual have a sense of what's physically happening there in Berlin, and hopefully the folks in Berlin are also checking in online to see all of us attending remotely.
Great.
So quickly, for those of us that were unable to join the previous session where you were a member of a member of the panel talking about citizen science data and its contribution to the SDGs, I'll just briefly introduce you to everybody. Anne is a member of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars that's in the US, and she leads the work on the Earth Challenge 2020, which is becoming one of the world's largest coordinated citizen science campaigns. I think it probably qualifies as the largest. I think it's no longer seeking. I think it's probably achieved it. And outside the Wilson Center, Anne is also the regional facilitator for the UN Environment North America, where she helps stakeholders, including business and NGOs, to provide inputs to the UN process. And alongside that, Anne is also one of the people supporting and helping develop the Citizen Science Global Partnership, which has a working group that addresses directly the Sustainable Development Goals with citizen science. So with that introduction, Anne, we had a really fantastic discussion session. You mentioned some of the things that you're involved in, and I've just mentioned the Earth Challenge 2020 as well. And you told us a little bit more about how it's working with plastics data from 3 different sources, and that this is directly targeted at 14.1.1. So maybe with that as a launch point, as others join us, you can tell us a little bit more. People, please join us in the video. We've got room for more people here to join in the video conversation. We can see you, and then we can chat more freely. And if you have questions in the chat, please ask them, and I will share them with Anne.
Sure. Thanks for that really nice introduction, Margaret, and thanks for having me. The thing that I most miss about life during non-COVID is the ability to meet people at conferences, especially. So I'm really, really excited to have this opportunity to connect in sort of a more personal setting. In terms of the Earth Challenge 2020 project, this was really interesting for me. A little bit of history. The State Department, through the Greening Diplomacy Initiative, these are the people who are responsible for maintaining the US's network of air quality monitors around the world, most notably on the embassy in Beijing. And Earth Day Network had worked together for about a decade before 2017, which is when the State Department actually found me giving a talk on data standards, which is a really objectively boring talk, and not a lot of people pay attention and not a lot comes out of it. So I was really delighted when at the end of this talk, this guy from the State Department walks up and says, I have a citizen science project, and I need your help. So basically, the role of the Wilson Center was to be the organization that understood what happened in citizen science and knew a little bit about the landscape. So along with a colleague named Allison Parker, our job and many others was to make this relevant from a science perspective, especially with an approach to the data interoperability aspects. So getting back around your question, Margaret, you mentioned that I talked about plastic pollution in a previous section. When Earth Day Network and State Department approached us, they wanted an app and a project that could study any aspect of human and environmental health. And we basically said, sorry, that can't happen. So Allison came up with a really great idea to launch a call for people to tell us, well, what is important. So we used Earth Day social media. The Wilson Center did some policy workshops, and we tapped our network of researchers and asked people around the world to tell us what are the most important questions in human and environmental health. And we got back a lot of responses. 7 continents, actually. There were people in Antarctica who really wanted to study microbes in ice. That didn't make the top 6. But the big topics that we finally selected out of this crowdsourcing call were climate change. What was interesting here is a lot of people wanted to know about the social science of climate change. So what can you example, make people, especially in the US, aware that science is a thing that is backed by science, as well as teaching them what you can do. Insect populations, which was really interesting. Biodiversity was a hot topic, but even within biodiversity, insects, air quality, water quality, food security, which we're working on with ECSA. If some of you were at the previous session, this is what Stefan Fritz was talking about. And then, of course, plastic pollution. So those are the 6 areas that we're investigating.
I love it that they started out with, let's map all things, gather all the data. Let's just choose one. Let's choose one to do it really, really well. I liked the process that you used for that, to get lots of people contributing ideas for what the Earth Challenge could be. And I can imagine there were a lot of really amazing ones. You mentioned the Arctic microbes and the ice. That would have been an amazing project, but not as global in reach, obviously, in terms of who is all impacted by it, but perhaps who all could participate. And it seems to me this is one of the biggest challenges with the Sustainable Development Goals and citizen science. We have these beautiful local examples, but scaling those up to really gather global data for global challenges is pretty tough.
Yeah, and it's especially problematic because the way that the SDGs are reported on, there's a lot of agency at the member state level. So people already have their ideas of the types of data that they might.
There we go. Fantastic.
Yay. Sorry,
Yay.
My internet cut out, but I logged on via mobile phone, so hopefully this will work out.
Fantastic.
You asked me a question and I interrupted you, so I'm sorry, Margaret.
I was thinking about this scaling problem that we have. Citizen science projects do some really beautiful work, and I love their local nature and their local community nature. But then scaling that up to touch on a global challenge is a really big one. And one of the other projects you mentioned was the Mosquito Alert project, and I think that's quite a nice example of a number of more localized initiatives having the potential to really be global initiatives. Can you tell us a little bit more of your experience of those kinds of local to global scaling?
So Global Mosquito Alert is really interesting to me because it goes bottom up and then it also goes top down. This really came together because the people who were leading the projects were really passionate about that. And I think that's because people who do citizen science for environmental monitoring or from the biodiversity community already understand that there's an established community of experts that they can tap, and people are dealing with a lot of the similar problems that they're facing. There are some nuances between air and water, like sensor use, of course, but in general, some of the problems at least are the same. And the people who were doing mosquito vector monitoring didn't feel that way. They felt that they were primarily focused on human health, but then there's also this environmental dimension. So it's a really interesting group of people. In terms of how the project scales, it's been really interesting to watch it since 2017 because it really is a consortium and different projects grew really unevenly. Mosquito Alert from Barcelona is, I think, the really classic example that many people may be familiar with. And they were really generous with their technology early on in terms of open sourcing the app, but then also, I think, equally importantly with their time. Playing a co-chair role in the consortium, but then also it's one thing to open source technology, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people could use it. And they were able to provide the hands-on expertise and guidance that different partners needed to actually stand up campaigns in Puerto Rico and Hong Kong. So when I think about scale, I really think that human dimension and that human capacity is really important. I know that the European Cost Action Program has also been really helpful for citizen science over there. We had some other projects that benefited from that, as well as Horizon 2020. And then I've just gotten some funding from the National Science Foundation about a month ago. So like 4 years into when we started working on it, and hopefully we'll see some more activities on the US side too. The challenges with scale are, it's kind of this local to global problem. Not everybody can monitor in the same way. So we were working with NASA early on when they were starting to stand up their mosquito habitat mapper project, and they saw Mosquito Alert and they recognized the scientific value. But one of NASA's communities is GLOBE, which is an international science diplomacy effort that includes a citizen science component and is targeted at elementary, middle, primary, not sure what the word is in Europe, schools around the world. And NASA concluded that asking children to go out and monitor adult vectors was a really strong liability concern. So that actually reinforced our approach to identifying a couple different protocols within a particular research area or types of methodologies, and then achieving scale by almost offering this menu of options that different groups could look at and see case studies of successful implementation, but then also have a leg up in terms of understanding how to structure the data or what technologies they could use.
That kind of work in the interoperability issues, I can imagine, is quite a big work. But that's really interesting that you've got the different interface options. There'll be a balance to strike there, and not having too many options in an app as well, which can be confusing for a participant. Has it been approached in a way that the organizers can kind of select what's locally relevant and what's not, so that you have a version of the app? That's
a really great question. The consortium, the organization, is basically invisible to any citizen science person, any citizen science volunteer who's actually using one of the projects. If they get really involved and are, kind of progressing through the ladder of participation and taking on like validation or community management roles, then they might learn more about the project and kind of encounter the Global Mosquito Alert Consortium through that perspective. But really what we're targeting is organization at the practitioner level. We haven't done nearly enough to engage citizen science volunteers. We have considered standing up a page on SciStarter, for example, which is a platform and a project directory that's based here in the US, but has a relatively global presence, where we put all of the mosquito monitoring projects in one place, but we just haven't done that because of capacity. So the way that volunteers find projects or find out about Global Mosquito Alert is through the individual networks still. So NASA and partners in the US, Mosquito Alert in Barcelona, Mugen Radar, many, many more, based on wherever they are around the world, which is a really interesting challenge for thinking about how to tell people that they're part of a larger global problem. They think they're just contributing to a specific research initiative.
That is an interesting issue. I can imagine on the side of motivations, you're most motivated locally, an issue that's impacting you directly. But I can imagine that people are quite motivated by a global issue as well. Do you see something in the motivations of the participants that touch on both local and global?
So we're lucky in that sense because mosquitoes literally move across borders, and there's this idea that you're kind of waiting for the onset of mosquitoes every spring, whether, there are some migration patterns, but then also just patterns of eggs hatching. So I think people are more aware that there's this global network. I think the bird community and certain biodiversity communities, people monitoring invasive species, would probably report similar challenges. I don't see motivation in mosquito world being as much of an issue as motivation in other areas, because the problem is so real. It's so acute. Something is biting you and you're worried about getting malaria.
Or it's certainly much more tangible. And imagine the awareness of it as a global issue is pretty high as well, both a local issue and a global issue. In the panel discussion, you also were talking about data aggregation as an opportunity, and I found that really quite interesting. You were saying that there's actually a market for data aggregation, and you saw that as an opportunity for the citizen science community to actually play a role in that. And you mentioned particularly the governance structure. Can you expand on that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about, and I don't have a good answer to it. I think it needs a community-based approach, probably starting with a workshop, but I can outline the problem a little bit. So our data aggregation work in plastic pollution got a lot of traction because there was a really strong demand signal from UN Environment Program, and Jillian, who was on the previous panel, for those of you who tuned in especially, was really keen to use Earth Challenge and plastic pollution as an opportunity to really see what we could do for citizen science through a case study of 1411. So we got a lot of hands-on guidance from a statistician when we were doing data integration, and also had a lot of tools from like a research group in Australia called CSIRO that had done an initial classification of different types of marine debris that we were able to leverage to create our interoperable taxonomy that allowed us to bring the three data sources together, although there are other data sources that can't be mapped to that taxonomy, which is a little bit frustrating. And then maybe because of the UN partnership and the channels that they have, and then also because this is related to a larger project called a global platform on marine debris, we started to get some interest from the private sector. So IBM worked with UN Environment on really equitable terms from a UN Environment IBM partnership perspective to take the Earth Challenge data, model it, and then create a platform that would enable different member states to use the data directly for SDG reporting. This wasn't something that we as the Earth Challenge Project had any capacity to do. We didn't have statisticians or modelers or anything like that. And now obviously they're keen to work with UN Environment on using citizen science data for other SDGs, which on one hand is really exciting, but I think, I was showing up to weekly calls and it was like, maybe a month and a half in before they realized that Earth Challenge 2020 was a citizen science platform that wasn't necessarily directly affiliated with the UN Environment Program. It was actually something different. And then even after we got that far and they learned what the Wilson Center was, there was still this challenge of, okay, and there are three concrete citizen science projects that are contributing data here. And that like really blew their mind. So I'm trying to think about like ways, knowing that IBM is going to want to work on other SDGs, and then we have other tech partners that are potentially interested on this as well, like Esri, which is a GIS company. How can we, if there are like 4 different rungs of this ladder from where they're getting the aggregated data to the people who are actually contributing it, how can we help narrow this gap? And then I'm also trying to think about how we can use methods for convening people, like through Global Mosquito Alert, to think about how we can convene data providers to be able to form kind of collectives that have a little bit more agency and a little bit authority, just because they aren't just one project, but they're many projects that have demonstrated the potential to create a global baseline, and then helping, maybe bring those consortiums to different groups like IBM that want to work with their data directly and try to, establish processes and partnership models up front. So then the next time somebody wants to work on citizen science for the SDGs from a big tech perspective, there's already a precedent in place about how this can be done in a way that benefits the specific projects that are involved.
Really interesting to see what kind of commercial partnership models come out of these conversations, because it is quite a balancing act, I can imagine. On the one hand, this kind of long-term citizen observatory approach needs serious investment to build up a community, but then timelines of data that extend over the long term. And supporting that, it's not something that a 3-year project funding is going to be able to cover. It needs alternate sources of support just to keep that the scale of effort supported. But commercialization of citizen science is, I'm sure, something that many people will have a bit of an allergic reaction to. There's some kind of balancing act there. Do you have some nice examples for us of things you're seeing in practice that are the way to strike that balance in a good way?
I'll answer that question first, but I just wanted to build on something else that you said, which relates to the norms and the ethics that the citizen science community has fostered. I wonder if that's like one pathway that we could take. So open data is technically and most importantly legally data that are available for anyone anywhere to use, depending on how it's licensed and in accordance with its licensing conditions. So if you're like an IBM or a Google and you see an open data set that has a non-commercial license on it, it's fair game. But the legal aspects of openness aren't necessarily congruent with the norms that are codified in, for example, the ECSA 10 principles of citizen science, things like providing volunteers feedback and the really important community support functions that you mentioned, Margaret. So I think that's one challenge that is really kind of hard to unpack, but important to unpack if we're going to be successful in this approach. In terms of people who have done it well, it being commercializing, I think about Earthwatch a lot. For those of you who are not familiar, it is a project that is centered in the US, but also has independent offices through a network in the UK, Earthwatch Europe, I believe Italy, and then India. And what Earthwatch does is takes different corporate groups out on corporate social responsibility expeditions and then has them do citizen science in the process. Earthwatch has some of their own programs like Freshwater Watch, but they're also partnering with Earth Challenge 2020 to use our app in some of their CSR campaigns. Because that's embedded in a much longer term program and a much longer term partnership, Earthwatch already has those models for engagement. And I think those can be helpful for other people, especially at the project level, who want to understand how we can work with the corporate world. But again, they had to be developed at some point in time.
We can't get away from needing some support from the corporate world or the world at some stage, especially when there's a really large technological build aspect to the platforms that are coming together. Is this one of the tangible forms of support that IBM is bringing into that partnership at the moment? Are they assisting with the technology development side of the equation?
Yeah, so I've worked with a couple different private sector partners, and IBM has been really great, primarily for UNEP, which has benefited the Wilson Center indirectly by not only donating technology, which a lot of companies will do, like Amazon, for example, is relatively generous with cloud credits. And there are groups like the Group on Earth Observations that have partnerships with Amazon around cloud that the citizen science community could use. But IBM actually brought data scientists to the table and people who were willing to get their, roll their sleeves up and get their hands dirty, actually working with citizen science data and trying to understand it. And I think that is what, in my mind, makes that partnership more promising than others, the investment of kind of human capital and an actual commitment to team building and teamwork, as opposed to kind of just swooping in and seeing this potentially valuable open data asset and then swooping back out again.
Yeah, it does sound like engagement and a real partnership, which is quite exciting because I do think we can accomplish more if we're able to work together in those ways. We have a question from the audience as well. Miguel has joined us with a question about citizen science and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and whether that citizen science is being able to be used yet for supporting environmental compliance and enforcement.
So Allison Parker at the Wilson Center was an ORISE fellow at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency before she joined us. And I would encourage anybody who is interested in a deep dive into the U.S. EPA to email her. If you just Google her name or go to the Wilson Center website, you'll be able to find her contact information there. I'm in pretty close contact with her former boss, Jay Benfrado, who is the head of citizen science at EPA. So I have a little bit of Jay's perspective to share. In general, when citizen science data is used in compliance, or as we think about it, regulation, it's because it comes in through the states. So EPA has a network of regional offices, and then within those regions, there are various state environmental authorities. And the typical use case that we consider for the direct application of citizen science data is that it becomes New York data or Region 2 data, and then it is Region 2 that is providing that authoritative data to the Environmental Protection Agency, because Region 2 has the authority to provide whatever data to EPA headquarters they would like to back up and justify their various programs. What EPA does at the headquarters level is facilitate broader capacity building for citizen science and environmental protection. There was obviously a lot of that under the Obama administration, and something that they were really focused on then was understanding community-based projects, as well as the top-down contributory style citizen science. In the US, this was actually really innovative, and I think EPA was one of the first leaders in that space at a time when a lot of people were focusing on contributory models of citizen science. Another thing that they're actually looking at during the current administration is data quality and coming up with a data quality handbook. And I believe they're also considering working on a quality assurance plan, like a QA/QC or template that could be used by citizen science projects at the regional level and then also the state level to help the agency deliver its mission.
Fantastic. It's been really exciting to see citizen science so formally embraced within federal authorities and agencies in the US, and that really get embedded into processes. And it feels like that comes back to the point that you were making in the earlier the earlier panel session about partnerships and the role of partnerships with authorities and scientists, and how the synergies that need to be sought there. Have you come? I know that you do a lot of knowledge sharing with people that are over here in Europe, and also with the Global Citizen Science Partnership. Are you seeing some European examples coming up?
Yes. It's really funny. This happened to me in the earlier sessions too, along with Europeans, Sven Schade, and another US colleague, Alex Day-Shabinin, who's at Columbia University in the Center for Earth Systems Research. I'm guest editing a special issue of a Frontiers journal on citizen science data and data management. And one of the perspectives that is currently being peer reviewed was actually written by a handful of European environmental protection agencies, and it's sharing their approach to citizen science, both at the project level and then also more from a cross-cutting perspective. So I thought the article was really great because, like I mentioned in my earlier session, I see a lot of federal authorities kind of aligning strategically with one or a small handful of citizen science projects just because their bandwidth is limited and they need to really understand those well. And then also starting larger programs using those projects as examples and success stories that should be elevated and encouraged to replicate whenever possible. And it was funny to see that approach on the European side as well. And I'm hoping that when that article finally makes it through the publication process, it will be a really good resource for people in Europe, the US, and elsewhere to be able to access.
I look forward to seeing it too. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Anne. We now have our 2:00 plenary session that's starting over in the main room, and that's with Thomas Mboa from the University of Ottawa. And I know that he's also got some really interesting things to share. So anybody that would like to leave and join the plenary session, we had one last question that showed up in the chat. So if you're able to linger with us for one more moment, and Annette was very curious to hear more about the Earth Challenge 2020 organization and just how many people are involved as staff and as coordinators behind the challenge.
That's a great question. It's been a relatively bare bones operation until recently. We have 3 organizations at the Wilson Center. We have probably 1.5 people working on it at any given time. And we're lucky that we're able to draw across a team with a lot of skills. So we have someone with a PhD in communications in my department, and her support has been really, really, really invaluable, as well as sort of the core team, which is Alex Long and then Matisse Meloche, who's currently talking about the project in the SDG festival. Earth Day Network always has at least one FTE as well, but we've really benefited from engagement at their leadership levels. My counterpart over there is Kathleen Rogers, who's the president of Earth Day Network, and really, really, really buys on to the vision and continually advocates for Earth Challenge 2020 to her board, which was especially helpful in the early days when the project was kind of struggling and COVID was a tremendous, tremendous disruption for Earth Day Network especially. And then on the US State Department side, there's absolutely no cost sharing between the State Department and anybody else in the project, which has its own challenges, but they are able to support the tech team, and all of the work on data integration is supported and funded by the US Department of State, working with primarily government contractors. So that's probably in monetary value far and away the single biggest source of support that the project has, but a lot of that work is invisible to those of us who are focused on the citizen science components. And I really think that in-kind has been some of the biggest support that we've gotten. That has certainly been the most meaningful.
Especially when you've got somebody with the energy of 2 people. That's one of your cheerleaders making things happen. Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you for your time, and thank you everybody for joining us here. It's too bad that we weren't able to let more people into the video session. Something was blocking that, unfortunately. But we'll see you at future video sessions throughout the rest of the day.
Thanks for your great moderation, Margaret. See everyone in the plenary.
See you at the plenary.